My parents spent my $52,000 college fund on my brother's third failed business and told me to figure it out. I did, worked 3 jobs, got my degree, built my life. Last month, Golden Boy got arrested for embezzlement. Dad called at 3 a.m. We need $80,000 for bail. I let it ring. $52,000. That's what my future was worth to my parents. And they handed every last cent of it to my brother like it was nothing, like I was nothing. And the funniest part, the part that still makes me laugh when I think about it at 2 in the morning, is that they genuinely expected me to thank them for teaching me independence. I need to back up a little, because if I just start with that, you won't understand why it hit the way it did, and honestly, I think the context is what makes the whole thing so much worse. My name is Marcus. I'm 29 years old, and I grew up in a house where everything revolved around my younger brother, Ethan. Not in a subtle way either. Not in the way where you look back as an adult and think maybe you were being oversensitive. No, this was the kind of favoritism where everybody saw it. Aunts, uncles, neighbors, teachers, everybody. And nobody said a word because my parents had this way of making it seem like Ethan just needed more. Like he was more fragile, more special, more deserving of attention. And I was the strong one. The one who didn't need anything. The one who could always figure it out. On his own. And I bought into that for a long time. I really did. Because when you're a kid and your parents tell you that you're tough enough to handle things on your own, you believe them. You take it as a compliment. You wear it like armor, and you don't realize until much later that what they were actually saying was, "We don't want to spend the energy on you." My dad, Robert, was a quiet man, the kind of father who was physically present but emotionally checked out in a way that you couldn't really pin down until you were old enough to recognize it. He went to work, he came home, he sat in his chair, and he agreed with whatever my mother said. Not because he believed it, but because agreeing was easier than fighting. He had this way of nodding along to things that should have made any reasonable person push back. And over the years I started to realize that the nod wasn't agreement. It was surrender, the kind that happens so gradually that the person doing it doesn't even notice they've given up on having a spine. My mother, Linda, was the engine of the household, the one who made every decision, controlled every dollar, and decided which son was worth investing in. And she decided early. She decided before I even had a chance. Ethan was 2 years younger than me, and from the time he could talk, he had this charm about him, this ability to make people feel like he was the most important person in the room, and my parents ate it up. When Ethan said he wanted guitar lessons, he got guitar lessons. When Ethan said he wanted to switch schools because he didn't like his teacher, they switched his school. When I asked if I could join the science club that had a $30 fee, my mom told me we needed to be smart with money, and maybe I could find a free activity instead. $30. She said that with a straight face while Ethan's guitar lessons were running $120 a month. And I remember standing in the hallway outside the kitchen after she said no, and I could hear Ethan in the living room practicing guitar, badly, the same 3 chords over and over, and I thought to myself, maybe I should learn to play guitar. Maybe then they'd notice. But even as a kid I knew that wasn't how it worked. It wasn't about what you did. It was about who you were. And I was the wrong son. But here's the thing, and this is important, I didn't grow up angry. I grew up confused. Because when you're a kid and the rules are different for you and your sibling, you don't think the rules are unfair. You think there's something wrong with you. You think you must not be good enough, must not be charming enough, must not be worth the investment. And that belief, that quiet, invisible belief, it shaped everything about who I became. I became the kid who didn't ask for things. I became the kid who worked odd jobs at 15, mowing lawns and washing cars and stacking shelves at the grocery store on weekends for $7.50 an hour. I became the kid who saved every dollar in an envelope under his mattress because somewhere deep down, I already knew that nobody was coming to save me. The college fund was supposed to be different, though. That was the one thing I held on to. My grandmother, my dad's mother, had set aside money when I was born, $52,000, specifically for my education, and my parents were the custodians of the account. Grandma died when I was 12, and before she passed, she held my hand in the hospital room and told me, and I remember this so clearly it still makes my chest tight. She said, "Marcus, that money is for your future. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She didn't say it to Ethan. She didn't say it to the room. She looked at me, only me, And I think even then she knew something was off about how my parents treated me, because grandmothers see things that everyone else is too close to notice. And I believed her. I held on to that promise like it was the last real thing anyone had ever given me, because in a lot of ways, it was. I found out the money was gone on a Tuesday in August, 3 weeks before I was supposed to start college. I'd driven to the bank to start the paperwork for transferring the funds to my university's bursar office. I was wearing a button-down shirt because I thought you were supposed to dress nicely when you went to a bank for something important, and I remember sitting across from the bank manager, a woman named Diane with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a small cactus on her desk, and she typed some things into her computer, and then her face changed. Not dramatically, not like in the movies, but just this slight shift, this tightening around her eyes, and she said, "Mr. Peters, the balance on this account is $412.17. And I laughed. I actually laughed, because I thought it was a mistake. I thought the system was glitched. I thought there was no possible universe in which $52,000 had turned into $412.17. But Diane wasn't laughing. She pulled up the withdrawal history and turned her monitor toward me. And there it was, months and months of withdrawals, large chunks, $10,000 here, $15,000 there, all going back almost 2 years, all authorized by Robert and Linda Peters. She asked me if I wanted printed copies. I said yes. She printed them without saying another word, and I think she knew, just from my face, what those pages meant. I drove home in silence. No music, no phone call, nothing. Just the sound of the engine and this ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but not from anger, from something deeper than anger, something that didn't have a name yet. When I walked into the house, the whole family was at the dinner table, Mom, Dad, Ethan, all of them eating like it was any other Tuesday, and I just stood there in the kitchen doorway holding the printed bank statements, and before I could even open my mouth, Ethan, with a mouthful of pasta, said something that I will never forget for as long as I live. He said, "Oh, did Mom and Dad tell you they used your college thing for my business?" "Yeah, they said you'd be cool with it." Like it was nothing. Like he was telling me they'd borrowed my lawnmower. Like $52,000 of my dead grandmother's money was a minor detail that had slipped everyone's mind. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet where people are thinking about what to say, but the kind where everyone already knows they're guilty and they're just waiting to see how bad the explosion is going to be. My mom put her fork down slowly. My dad's jaw stopped mid-chew. And Ethan, to his credit or maybe to his eternal damnation, just kept eating, because to him this genuinely wasn't a big deal. It was information he assumed I already had and was fine with. And that obliviousness, that complete inability to understand that he had just casually confirmed the worst thing that had ever happened to me, was somehow more painful than the theft itself. But there was no explosion. I just stood there, looking at Ethan, then at my mom, then at my dad, who was staring at his plate the same way I imagine my grandmother would have stared at him if she'd been alive to see what he'd done with her money. My mom spoke first, because of course she did. She said, "Marcus, sit down, let's talk about this like adults." And then she launched into what I can only describe as the most rehearsed, most delusional justification I have ever heard in my life. She said Ethan's business was an investment in the family, that when it took off, everyone would benefit, that they'd looked at the numbers, and it was a smart move, that the college fund was just sitting there doing nothing, and this was a way to make it work for everyone. She said the word everyone 4 times. I counted, and not once, not a single time, did the word sorry come out of her mouth. She actually seemed annoyed that I was upset, like I was the one being unreasonable, like $52,000 of stolen inheritance was a conversation that deserved eye rolls and sighs. My dad said nothing. He just sat there, fork still in hand, eyes on the table, and I watched him, really watched him, and I saw it for the first time with total clarity. My father wasn't neutral. My father wasn't the quiet peacekeeper I'd always told myself he was. My father was a coward. He knew it was wrong. He knew Grandma's money was mine. He knew she'd made him promise. And he let it happen because saying no to Linda was harder than watching his own son lose everything. He chose comfort over his own child, and he'd been making that choice my entire life, in 1,000 small ways that had all led to this one enormous betrayal. I looked at my mother and said, "So what am I supposed to do about college?" And she said, And I swear to you this is verbatim because it's been burned into my brain for 8 years, she said. Marcus, you're the smart one. You'll figure it out. Your brother needs this more than you do. Your brother needs this more than you do. Like my future was a sweater that didn't fit Ethan right, so they gave it to him anyway, because he looked colder. I walked out of the kitchen. I went to my room. Except it wasn't really my room anymore, because 6 months earlier, while I was working a summer job, my parents had converted half of it into a home office for Ethan's business. My bed was still there, pushed into the corner like an afterthought, but the rest of the room was his. A desk that took up a third of the floor space, a whiteboard covered in business plans that would never work, a filing cabinet, and a brand new iMac that I now realized had been purchased with my grandmother's money. They had actually told me to start sleeping on the couch when Ethan needed to work late, and I had done it, because I was still the kid who thought if he was agreeable enough, if he was invisible enough, if he made himself small enough, maybe they'd start treating him like he mattered. But you can't make yourself small enough for people who've already decided you're nothing. There is no level of accommodation that turns neglect into love. That night, lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I made a decision. I didn't make it with anger, and I didn't make it with some dramatic speech in my head. I just decided, very quietly, very clearly, that I was done waiting for my family to see me. If they wanted me to figure it out, I would figure it out. But they would never benefit from whatever I figured out. That was the deal I made with myself at 18 years old on a couch that smelled like old cushions, and I have kept that deal every single day since. I enrolled in community college for the first semester because it was all I could afford. I got a night shift at a warehouse, loading trucks from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 4 days a week. The work was brutal, the kind of physical labor that doesn't just tire your body but drains something from your soul, because you're surrounded by other people who ended up there for different reasons, but the same result. And every night felt like proof that the world my parents had promised me was a lie. On weekends, I tutored high school kids in math and science. $25 an hour, cash, sometimes 3 or 4 students a day, and I'd sit at their kitchen tables and help them with calculus while their parents brought us snacks, and I'd think about how strange it was that these strangers treated me with more respect in 2 hours than my own family had shown me in 18 years. And on the mornings I wasn't at the warehouse, I picked up shifts at a coffee shop near campus called The Grind, which felt almost poetic given the circumstances, and the tips were decent if you smiled enough, so I smiled. I smiled a lot. I smiled until my face hurt, and then I smiled some more. My grades nearly collapsed that first semester because there were weeks where I was sleeping 3 hours a night and showing up to lectures with my hands still sore from loading boxes and my eyes burning from the fluorescent lights of the warehouse. But I clawed back. I clawed back because every time I wanted to quit, every time my body was screaming and my brain was fog and my eyes couldn't focus on the textbook in front of me, I heard my mother's voice saying, "You'll figure it out." And it fueled me in a way that nothing else ever had, because I was going to figure it out, and she was never going to touch a single piece of what I built. Some people are driven by inspiration. I was driven by a kitchen table and a mouthful of pasta and the words, "They said you'd be cool with it." Nobody from my family asked me how I was paying for school. Not a single one of them. My mom started calling about 3 months after I moved out, and the calls were surreal, genuinely surreal, because she talked about absolutely everything except the thing that mattered. She talked about Thanksgiving plans and asked if I'd seen the new season of some show I'd never watched and mentioned that Aunt Carol's knee surgery went well and told me that Ethan's business was really picking up this time, which was the 3rd time she'd used that exact phrase about the 3rd different business, and not once, not even in passing, did she say, "Marcus, how are you paying for college?" It was like the $52,000 had never existed. Like my grandmother had never existed. Like the bank statements I'd been holding in that kitchen doorway were a fever dream that only I remembered. And the worst part wasn't the silence about the money. The worst part was that she genuinely believed everything was fine. She had rewritten the story in her own mind so completely that she couldn't even see what she'd done. And then, about 6 months after I'd last spoken to any of them, Ethan texted me. Just casually, the way he texted about everything. Like the world was a simple, uncomplicated place where people didn't do terrible things to each other. He said, "Hey bro, I'm launching a new venture, could really use a website. You're good with computers, right? Would be huge if you could put something together for me. For free, obviously." He didn't offer to pay. He didn't ask if I had time. He didn't acknowledge that the last time he launched a venture, it cost me my entire future. He just assumed I'd help, the way you assume the sun will come up, because that's what Marcus does. Marcus helps. Marcus figures it out. Marcus doesn't complain. Marcus doesn't have needs of his own. I didn't respond. I just screenshot the message and saved it, because I'd started doing that, saving things, not out of spite, but out of a need to remind myself that I wasn't making this up, that the pattern was real, that the way my family treated me wasn't normal no matter how many times they acted like it was. I transferred to a 4-year university after my second year of community college. My GPA was a 3.7 despite everything, and I'd earned a partial scholarship that covered about a third of tuition. The rest came from the warehouse, the tutoring, the coffee shop. Danny, my best friend since middle school, the kind of friend who doesn't ask if you need help. He just shows up with help and pretends it was his idea. Let me crash at his family's place rent-free for 2 semesters when my lease fell through. His mother, Mrs. Patterson, used to leave plates of food outside my door because she could hear me studying at midnight and she knew I hadn't eaten, and she never once made me feel like a charity case. Never once made me explain why a 20-year-old with a family was sleeping in her guest room. She just fed me and washed my clothes and told me she was proud of me when I aced my midterms. There are people in this world who show you what family is supposed to look like, and the Pattersons showed me. They didn't know me anything, and they gave me everything, and I will never forget that for as long as I live. I graduated with honors. I wore my cap and gown and walked across that stage, and there was nobody in the audience from my biological family. Not because I didn't invite them. Well, actually, exactly because I didn't invite them. Danny was there. Mrs. Patterson was there, crying like I was her own son, and in every way that mattered, I was. A few friends from my cohort were there, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. I landed a job within 2 months of graduating, junior analyst at a financial consulting firm, $68,000 a year, which felt like $1 million to someone who'd been living on warehouse wages and coffee shop tips. I remember getting the offer letter and sitting in my car in the parking lot reading it 3 times because I kept thinking there must be a catch. There must be a mistake. Good things don't happen to Marcus. And then I called Danny and said, I got it. And he screamed so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Within 18 months, I'd been promoted. Within 3 years, I was a senior consultant making $112,000 with a corner office and a team of 4 analysts reporting to me. And I'd moved into my own apartment in the city, a clean 1-bedroom with big windows and a kitchen where I cooked meals that I actually sat down to eat at a real table. And sometimes I'd stand in that apartment and just look around and think, I built this. Every single piece of this is mine. Nobody gave this to me. Nobody can take it from me. My family found out about my success the way I wanted them to, which was not for me. Aunt Carol, my dad's sister, the only family member who had ever treated me like I existed, spotted me at a regional finance conference where I was one of 3 speakers presenting on risk assessment strategies to a room of about 200 people. I didn't even know she was there until she called my mom that evening, and apparently the conversation was something along the lines of, Linda, I just saw Marcus give a presentation at the Marriott. He was on a panel, in a suit. People were shaking his hand afterward. Did you know he's some kind of financial consultant? He looked really, really good, Linda. He looked like he's doing better than all of us. And just like that, the phone call started again. But different this time. This time there was an energy behind them, a curiosity, a hunger that I could hear even through voicemail. My mom called twice in 1 week, something she hadn't done in years, and suddenly she wanted to know about my job and my apartment, and whether I was seeing anyone nice, and did I want to come home for Christmas. We could do the whole thing, turkey and everything, just like old times. The warmth that had never been there when I needed it was suddenly overflowing now that I was something she could brag about at church and at book club and in line at the grocery store. I could already hear her telling people, oh yes, my son Marcus, he's a financial consultant in the city, doing very well for himself, as if she'd had anything to do with it. As if the woman who said, figure it out, deserved credit for what I figured out. I didn't return the calls. Not out of revenge, not out of cruelty, just because I had nothing to say to her that wouldn't be a lie, and I was done lying to myself about who my family was. Now here's where the story takes the turn that I still sometimes can't believe actually happened, even though I lived through it. Even though I have the newspaper clippings saved in a drawer in my desk. I was at my desk on a Wednesday morning, 9:47 a.m. I remember because I'd just refilled my coffee and was about to open a client file, and my coworker Priya walked over to my cubicle with her phone in her hand, and this look on her face like she'd just swallowed something wrong. And she said, "Marcus, isn't your last name Peters?" And I said yes. And she turned her phone toward me, and there was a local news article with the headline that included my brother's full name and the word embezzlement, and a mugshot that looked like a completely different person from the golden boy I'd grown up with. $347,000. That's how much Ethan had stolen from his employer over a period of 2.5 years. He'd been working as a finance manager at a mid-sized logistics company called Bridgeport Freight, and he'd been siphoning money through fake vendor accounts, inflated invoices, phantom employees, reimbursement claims for trips he never took, the whole playbook, every trick in the book, as if he'd studied fraud the way I'd studied finance. A coworker in the accounting department had noticed discrepancies during a routine quarterly audit, flagged them to compliance, and within 6 weeks of the investigation starting, Ethan was arrested at his apartment on a Thursday morning at 6:15 a.m. The article said he answered the door in boxers and a t-shirt. I don't know why that detail stuck with me, but it did. But here's the part that made the arrest even worse, the part that turned a bad situation into a catastrophic one. Ethan had been lying to my parents for years. Years. He told them his businesses were succeeding. He told them he was making 6 figures legitimately. He rented a flashy apartment downtown, $2,800 a month, drove a leased BMW 5 Series, wore designer clothes he couldn't afford, posted pictures on social media of restaurant meals at places where a single entree costs more than I used to make in a shift at the coffee shop, and weekend getaways to places like Miami and Napa Valley, and all of it, every single piece of it, was funded either by stolen money or by credit card debt that he was juggling across 9 different cards. The arrest didn't just expose the embezzlement. It unraveled the entire fiction of Ethan's life, every story, every boast, every business is really picking up, phone call to our parents. All of it was smoke, which meant every decision they'd ever made to invest in him over me was based on a lie, which meant the $52,000 they took from my future and handed to their golden boy was given to a fantasy that never existed. My phone rang at 3:07 a.m. on a Saturday. I was in bed, and I saw my dad's name on the screen, and something in my chest went very still. Not panic, not anger, just this absolute stillness, like my body knew before my brain did what this call was about. I let it ring twice, 3 times, 4 times, watching the screen glow in the dark of my bedroom. And then I picked up, and the voice on the other end wasn't my dad's. It was Ethan's. He was calling from my father's phone, from the police station, and his voice was shaking in a way I'd never heard before, stripped of all the charm, all the confidence, all the golden boy shine that had gotten him everything he'd ever wanted and none of what he actually needed. And he said, "Marcus, bro, I know things have been weird between us, but I need you right now. Blood is blood. Man, you have to help me. I need $80,000 for bail and mom and dad don't have it. And you're the only one who. I mean, you're doing well now, right? Aunt Carol said you're doing really well, and I just need you to come through for me this one time." And then my father's voice came on, and he was crying. My father, Robert Peters, the man who had never once in my life showed me a single unfiltered emotion, who had sat at that dinner table with his fork in his hand while my mother told me to figure it out, was sobbing into the phone at 3 in the morning saying, "Marcus, you're the only one who can help us. Please, he's your brother, we can't leave him in there, please." And then my mother grabbed the phone, because of course she did, because Linda always has to have the last word, and her voice was sharp and desperate and furious all at the same time, a voice I recognized from childhood, the voice she used when she was losing control and needed to get it back. And she said, "After everything we did for you, after we raised you and fed you and gave you a roof over your head, you owe this family. Marcus, you owe us." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment and looked at the ceiling of my apartment, the apartment I'd paid for with warehouse hands and coffee shop smiles and 4 years of sleeping 3 hours a night. And I thought about my grandmother holding my hand in that hospital room. And I thought about the bank manager named Diane turning her monitor toward me. And I thought about Ethan's mouth full of pasta saying, "Yeah, they said you'd be cool with it." And I thought about a couch that Smelled like old cushions and a room that wasn't mine anymore and a $30 science club fee that was too expensive for me, but not for guitar lessons. And I said, very calmly, so calmly that I could hear my own heartbeat between the words, I figured it out, Mom. Now it's Ethan's turn. And I hung up. The aftermath unfolded over the next several months, and I watched it from a distance, not with satisfaction exactly, but with a kind of exhausted clarity that I think only comes when you've spent your whole life waiting for the truth to reveal itself, and it finally does. My parents took out a second mortgage on their house to cover Ethan's bail. $80,000 they didn't have, borrowed against a home that was already leveraged from the loan they'd co-signed for Ethan's second failed business years earlier, the one I only found out about from Aunt Carol at a family barbecue where she mentioned it casually, not realizing I had no idea. The one where they'd put the house up as collateral and nearly lost everything and somehow decided the lesson from that experience was to keep betting on Ethan because this time, surely this time, it would pay off. The second mortgage went through, Ethan made bail, and then, 3 weeks before his court date, he missed his hearing. Just didn't show up. His lawyer couldn't reach him. His phone was off. The court issued a bench warrant, and my parents were suddenly not just financially destroyed. Their son was officially a fugitive. The bail was forfeited. $80,000 gone. The house, which was now mortgaged twice over, was in genuine danger of foreclosure. Everything they'd built over 40 years was crumbling, and the son they'd bet on was running from the mess instead of facing it. The family split. That's the only way I can describe it. It cracked right down the middle like a plate that had been held together with tape for years, and finally someone dropped it hard enough to shatter it for good. Aunt Carol called me and said, I want you to know that I think you did the right thing, and your grandmother would have been proud of you. She was crying when she said it. My Uncle David, my mom's brother, a man who had never once in my life shown interest in my existence, called me at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday to tell me I was cold-blooded, and that family helps family no matter what, and that I should be ashamed of myself. And I let him finish, and then I said, Uncle David, where were you when they spent my college fund? And the line went quiet and he hung up. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 6 years sent me a text that just said, respect. My mom's best friend from church apparently told her at a service that Marcus had every right to say no, and my mom stopped going to that church. She found a new one across town where nobody knew the story. The whole thing was like watching dominoes fall in every direction at once, and every person who fell revealed exactly who they were based on which direction they tipped. About 4 months after the bail call, I received a letter. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately because Ethan had the same handwriting he'd had since 3rd grade. These big loopy letters that leaned to the right like they were in a hurry to get somewhere important. The letter was 2 pages long, written on lined paper that looked like it came from a commissary, and I read it sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee. And by the time I finished, I was laughing. Not a happy laugh, not a cruel laugh, just the kind of laugh that comes out when the absurdity of your life reaches a pitch that your body doesn't know how else to process. The letter wasn't an apology, not even close, not even in the neighborhood of an apology. It was a request. Ethan wanted me to hire him a lawyer, a real one, a good one, because the public defender didn't understand his situation and wasn't fighting hard enough. He wrote about how the embezzlement was more complicated than it looked and how he'd been under a lot of pressure from the company, and how the system is designed to crush people like me who just made a mistake. A $347,000 mistake made over 2.5 years through a network of fake vendors. Just a mistake. And then, at the very bottom of the second page, in those big loopy letters, underlined twice, he wrote a sentence that I have read probably 200 times since, and will probably read 200 more before I die. You always had it easy, Marcus. You just don't see it. You always had it easy. The kid who lost $52,000 and slept on a couch in his own house, and worked 3 jobs simultaneously, and ate meals left outside a guest room door by someone else's mother, and didn't have a single family member at his graduation, that kid had it easy. According to the man who was handed everything, burned it all down, stole from strangers when there was nothing left to take from family, and was now sitting in a cell writing letters asking for more. I had it easy. I framed the letter. I actually drove to a frame shop on a Saturday morning and had it professionally matted in navy blue and framed in simple black wood, and it hangs in my home office now. right next to my degree from the university I paid for myself. People who visit sometimes notice it and ask about it, and I just say it's a reminder. I don't explain what it reminds me of, because the people who need to understand already do, and the people who don't, well, no amount of explaining will get them there. The last chapter of this story, at least for now, came about 2 months after the letter. My dad showed up at my apartment building on a Sunday afternoon. Not my mom, just him, alone, which in itself was so unusual that the doorman called me twice to confirm because he thought it might be a mistake. My father hadn't done anything alone in 30 years. Every decision, every trip, every phone call, every thought in his head went through Linda first, and here he was, standing in my lobby by himself, looking like a man who had walked out of his own life for an afternoon just to see if he still could. I buzzed him in. I don't know why. Some stubborn remnant of the kid who still wanted his father to be better than he was. Some stupid, unkillable hope that lives in the part of your brain that doesn't listen to reason. He looked old. Not just older, but old in the way that happens when life catches up to you all at once and 20 years of avoided consequences land on your shoulders in a single season. His hair had gone completely gray. His hands shook slightly when he reached for the glass of water I gave him. He sat on the edge of my couch, the same man who used to sit in his chair every evening saying nothing, and he was quiet for a long time. And then he said something I'd waited my entire life to hear, and also something that made me realize waiting for it had been the biggest waste of time of my life. He said, "I know about the fund, Marcus. I always knew. Your mother said it was the right thing to do, and I didn't fight her. I didn't have the spine to fight her. I never had the spine to fight her on anything. Not with Ethan, not with you, not with any of it. Your grandmother made me promise to protect that money, and I broke that promise the day your mother first brought it up, and I've known it every single day since. I wake up knowing it, and I go to sleep knowing it." And I looked at my father, really looked at him, this small gray man sitting on my couch in an apartment he could never afford, and I realized something that I think had been forming in me for years, but I'd never quite been able to put into words. My father wasn't the villain of this story. My mother wasn't the villain of this story. Ethan wasn't the villain of this story. The villain was silence. The villain was every moment someone knew something was wrong and chose comfort over truth, chose the easier son over the right thing, chose peace in the house over peace in their conscience. My father wasn't evil. He was just a coward. And cowardice, I've learned, when it's practiced long enough and consistently enough, does exactly the same amount of damage as cruelty. Maybe more, because at least cruelty is honest about what it is. I didn't yell at him. I didn't cry. I didn't forgive him either, because forgiveness requires something to forgive, and what my father was offering me wasn't an apology, it was a confession, and confessions are for the person giving them, not the person receiving them. I just said, "I know, Dad." And he nodded, the same nod I'd seen 1,000 times, the nod that meant he understood but wouldn't do anything about it. And he left. And I closed the door and stood in my apartment, the one I built with my own 2 hands from nothing. And I let out a breath that I think I'd been holding since I was 18 years old, sitting across from a woman named Diane, being told that my future was worth $412.17. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.